Hello, my name is Eric Allenton. I'm going to be presenting some information about interviewing tips and strategies for success based on information that I've compiled over the course of my career and some strategies that we recommend here at the University of Cincinnati. So the agenda for this screencast is to cover the following. So we're going to discuss what employers look for in candidates of consideration. We'll discuss the preparation process for interviews and give you some insight into what that should look like. We'll discuss the dress and the attire that you should be wearing for in-person interviews. We'll provide you with information on various interview types that could occur. We'll give you insight into various common interview questions as well as responses that you could prepare in advance of the actual interview. And then finally, we will wrap up with some tips and recommendations for follow-up and for communication post-interview. So first off, I wanted to provide you with a little bit of insight into what employers actually want from students. So myself and another colleague conducted a study back in 2016 where we had a chance to assess hundreds of different employer partners associated with our division of experience-based learning and career education here at the University of Cincinnati. These are some of the various attributes and qualities that our companies have indicated they are very interested in. So you'll note, for instance, some of these are intangibles. For instance, personality, confidence is ranked very highly by a lot of companies associated with our program. Eagerness, enthusiasm about a position or about your particular field. Inquisitive, inquisitive personality or the ability to ask questions. And then everything such as structure of your resume, attention to detail, that sort of thing. So hopefully this provides you with a little bit of insight into what companies are actually looking for in students. You'll also notice the various percentages of companies that indicated that these were important attributes in job candidates that they were considering for the future. So some other things that our employers look for in the various candidates they're considering. Well, we had employers indicate also an interest in things such as project management, the ability to work on a team, the completion of classes, showing that you have an established GPA or an academic record, and also some of the content of the classes associated with your academic curriculum. Communication skills are regularly seen as very, very important for a number of our companies, and that includes both written and oral communication. And then just to highlight another one, I'll share this: preparation for the interview. So preparation is key, and I will reiterate that throughout the presentation that I'm giving today. But ensure that you are prepared, you've done your research on the front end, you know not only about the position, but you know a great deal about the company in advance of your interview. So moving on, we want to talk a little bit about dress and what this should look like in most cases. Now, I think as we progress throughout 2017, 2018, and beyond, business professional attire is maybe becoming less of a necessity for some companies in an interview process, but I always recommend leaning on the side of somewhat conservatism when it comes to dressing for an interview. So I still recommend personally, and I recommend this to all of my students, that you should have some type of business professional attire as your default unless you're told otherwise. So what does business professional attire look like? Let's examine this just from the case of our female candidates first. So traditionally this is a jacket with a skirt or pants. I recommend having something such as black, gray, or navy blue, avoiding linen colors, avoiding lighter colors, tans, things that are maybe trendy during the summer, and you could get away with perhaps wearing, to more of an informal event. Stay with kind of the black, gray, or navy blue. Your skirt should be knee length or longer. I recognize that a lot of skirts are cut higher than that nowadays, but the recommendation generally for an interview and from the perspective of business professional attire is the skirt should be knee length or longer. Limit your jewelry. You can definitely wear earrings or a necklace if you would like, but I highly recommend not including additional body piercings or things especially that are visible to an interviewer. Closed-toe shoes should be worn, so shoes that aren't showing any type of skin or toe, obviously, at the point of the shoe is ideal when considering business professional attire for females. Body art. Again, this is something a little bit more common, especially with millennial generation applicants nowadays. However, body art should be covered if at all possible, just to avoid an employer creating some type of misperception about you as a candidate. You would hate for your body art to be some type of deterrent for them formulating an opinion that isn't necessarily correct. Heels or flats are perfectly appropriate, and then light fragrance is optional, but do consider the fact that some individuals have allergies or a very strong perfume or fragrance may trigger some adverse feeling or sense on behalf of the interviewer. So I do recommend considering that when applying some type of fragrance. Business professional for men. What does this look like? Again, black, dark gray, or a navy blue suit is most appropriate. Ensure that you have matching shoes and a belt. So that means not black shoes and a brown belt, for instance. But if you're wearing black shoes, you should be wearing a black belt as well, and ensure those are coordinated together. Your shoes should be scuff-free, so ensure those are either polished or taken care of and cleaned up in advance of the interview. Wear a tie. Clip-on tie is not appropriate. Ensure it's an actual tie. If you're not sure how to tie one, there are tons of video tutorials on how to do that, and I recommend checking those out on a site like YouTube. No tuxedos. Believe it or not, I've actually seen students wear tuxedos to interviews and career fair events, and this is a very, very overly formal piece of attire that is not traditionally acceptable. So avoid those. Again, with body art and piercings, ensure those are not exposed. If you have an earring or something, I recommend removing your earring for interview purposes. Light cologne is optional, again, not heavy on the fragrance. And then black or navy blue socks. Some individuals have made the mistake of wearing white socks or colored socks of some sort, and believe it or not, that is very distracting and considered something that it isn't very attentive to detail from the perspective of many of our employer partners. So, what to bring, you should bring for an interview, I think is critically important. So never show up to an interview site without any materials. You'll look unprepared. The first thing I highly recommend is ensuring you have a pen, preferably a metal pen or a black pen, again leaning on the side of somewhat conservatism here, and ensure this is not a colored Mickey Mouse pen or something like that. Ensure your pen looks professional to some degree. Additionally, you should have a pad folio of some sort, or a professional notebook. So I provided an image here of just what a basic pad folio would look like. It's a leather or pleather substance of sorts. It just folds. It traditionally has paper for note-taking and a pocket for the insertion of other materials or content you would want to provide. So a pad folio is a great thing to have. It allows you to take notes throughout the interview, and it also allows you to write down various talking points or questions that you you may have for the actual interviewer. Always bring 2 to 3 copies of your resume if possible. You never know who you could be meeting with in some cases, and it might be necessary for you to actually give them a little bit more context in terms of who you are as a candidate. So always having a resume available is important, and you can provide that to the interviewer if requested. And then I mentioned this, but this is, I feel, very critical. A paper with notes. I always, in preparation for my interviews, I always, on paper in advance of the interview and inserted in my Padfolio, I always have talking points that I want to make throughout the interview process, and talking points that I really want to emphasize as I'm being interviewed. I recognize that the interviewer does not know me in most cases as a candidate or as an applicant, so I want to provide them with as many positive components or associations as possible as I talk about myself and my experience. And then finally, I recommend actually writing down questions you have for companies. There may be questions that pop up over the course of the interview as you learn more and more about the company and the position. However, you can never be too overly prepared. So I recommend having what I refer to as informed questions for companies written down, so you have those as a reference when it comes to the point in the interview when you can actually ask questions. So I'll go on and further explain what informed questions look like. So 4 common types of interviews that you will likely conduct or be a part of at some point in your life. So phone interviews are still very prevalent. This is often an initial screening point for considering applicants. The traditional in-person interview is still very popular. Likely before you're hired for a position, whether it's a co-op, an internship, or a full-time position of some sort, you will have to take part in an actual in-person interview. There could be a group or panel interview that actually occurs. This is just an opportunity to meet with a variety of interview representatives at the same time. And then finally, increasingly more and more, especially as certain jobs and certain responsibilities and positions become outsourced, or geographic location becomes less important, online interviews are taking place. So these are things such as Skype, Google Hangouts, or utilizing a device like a Polycom phone conferencing machine, where you have a chance to conduct some type of phone or virtual interview in that way. 3 categories of interview questions I want you to be aware of. So one is called behavioral. Behavioral interview questions are very, very important and very common. So these are the types of questions where the interviewer is actually going to say to you, hey, tell me about a time when. So for instance, it could be, tell me about a time when you exhibited a high degree of leadership, or tell me about a time when you had to work collaboratively in a team environment. So preparation for these types of behavioral questions that you will inevitably be asked at some point in time is important. Case study or even situational types of interviews is the second type. This is kind of a theoretical question for you. So how would you, or what would you do? So for instance, what would you do when you are dealing with an employee, for instance, that isn't necessarily willing to collaborate and you need their cooperation? So these are those theoretical questions. They haven't necessarily occurred in your life or in your work experience at this time, but they are important nonetheless. And then finally, you have the traditional resume-based interview. So that'll be an individual likely looking at your resume and indicating, you mentioned on your resume that you have, for instance, experience with Java, JavaScript, and C#. Could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of your comfort level with those? So recognize anything on your resume is fair game. So how to respond? Responding is critical, and I recommend a method that has been used for a very long time to frame your responses, particularly with reference to behavioral and case study or situational type interviews. So this method is actually referred to as the STAR method. STAR is an acronym for responding to these types of interview questions. It stands for situation, tasks, action, and results. So you begin your response by describing the situation or the scenario that you're involved in. You indicate the tasks that need to be accomplished as a result of the situation. Action is what did you do, and I emphasize you. So what did you do specifically in your involvement with this situation? And then finally, the results component is what results did you actually get from the situation or the scenario that you described. So again, emphasizing the STAR method as a means for framing your interview responses for both the behavioral and case study types of interviews. Again, it's situation, task, action, results. And then I think it's important to identify some of the most common interview questions, and also for you to have a chance to prepare for these in advance of your interview. So you should never go into an interview without refreshing your skill set, without refreshing your responses, and ensuring that you are on point and very concise about the way in which you communicate. So I provided an example of the 10 most common interview questions. This is from a 2015 U.S. News and World Report, and I still think it is very relevant to this day. One of the most common questions, and you will receive this inevitably at some point in your life, is this idea of tell me about yourself. This is very similar to like an elevator pitch. It is a very open-ended statement where the employer is looking for you to provide some type of context about yourself and to give them an idea of who you are as a candidate in some type of 30-second to perhaps a minute and a half directed response. And this is a very challenging question, I think, to respond to, so it will take some practice for you to become concise about this, because there is very limited direction in terms of the way in which you can convey information about yourself that would be important to one of our employer partners. And then scrolling down the list, I also bolded another question that I think is important. A lot of companies will ask you, what do you know about our company? So again, emphasizing the preparation component that's necessary to be successful in an interview. You do need to do your research on the front end. Not only research the position that you're applying for, but research the company as a whole. Read about them in the news. Read about perhaps them in the stock market and how they're performing in that sense. You should do a thorough job of preparing yourself so you know at least some talking points about the company that are very accurate when that question is asked. And then after the interview, I alluded to this before, and I mentioned this before, that it's very important to ask questions when you're given the opportunity after the interview. And the questioning piece gives you an opportunity to learn more about the position, but also to have a chance to show the company that you actually know a good deal about them if you frame your question appropriately. And I can tell you, if you show a company that you know a great deal about them through what I refer to as an informed question, they will be very, very impressed, and that will be something that will stick in their mind as a very positive association with you as a candidate. So for instance, I want to first provide you with an example of an uninformed question. So an uninformed question, hypothetically for, let's say we're interviewing for General Electric. So an uninformed question would be, do you have any jobs for students this summer? This shows you know nothing about the company. It shows that you have done next to no research on whether or not there are job opportunities or availabilities for you, and it doesn't convey anything that would be impressive from an employer standpoint. Now, An informed question is different in the sense that it provides the employer with some contextual knowledge that you know about the company. So, for instance, the informed alternative could be, I recently read that GE is working with the U.S. Army to develop a new advanced turbine engine for the Pentagon's helicopter fleet. I was really impressed with this news. What types of opportunities exist for students related to the development of new engine technologies? So there is a vast difference between those two. The informed question provides the employer with a lot of information that you know specifically about their company, and I guarantee you it will be impressive. So after the interview, an additional checklist for you is, if you would like, you can ask how you did. You don't have to if you don't feel comfortable with that, but I think it's perfectly okay to say, hey, how did I do? How was my performance, or what are your thoughts? Perfectly okay, and in fact, this is something that's a strategy recommended by Matthew Moran in his book called Building Your IT Career. You can ask about the process and the timeline. It's very fair to understand when this employer could be responding to you, so you know whether or not to accept other interview opportunities or potentially other job offers. Write or call the employer to thank them for the opportunity. So I always, if the timeline permits, I always write an actual handwritten card to the individuals that I've met with during an interview. I think that goes a long way, and that's a bit of a lost art. If you have a bit of a tighter timeline, an email thank you is perfectly appropriate. And if you would prefer to speak to anybody in person, usually a phone call is completely okay. So, but definitely take the time to create a formal thank you. And then finally, collect all the contact information of the individuals that you met with. So it's perfectly okay to ask for business cards or any type of information so that you know and remember who those individuals were when you had a chance to actually conduct your interview. So finally, just wrapping things up, the takeaways that I want you to have from this presentation. Preparation is key. So prepare, prepare, prepare. I even provided the quote, one of my favorite quotes by John Wooden, failure to prepare is preparing to fail. So you cannot over prepare for an interview, so make sure you take the time to research the company, practice yourself, ensure that you're well organized in advance of the actual interview experience. Refine your elevator pitch specifically in that tell me about yourself statement that is one of the most common questions or statements that will be asked by any employer that is considering candidates. Practice your answers. Go through a list of questions that are very common. I recommend maybe using that top 10 list from the U.S. News and World Report that I provided. Bring your resume. Ensure it's perfect. There are no grammatical errors or formatting errors. Research the company on the front end. Everything you possibly can gather news-wise from their website, from LinkedIn, or within the stock market. And then develop informed questions for the company to show them that you have further knowledge of them in advance of the interview. Write your talking points in your Padfolio. So indicate any points of emphasis that you want to make, as well as any questions that you have. And then finally, dress for success. Business professional is always my initial recommendation unless you are told otherwise. So ensure that you are dressed appropriately for that. So this was an overview of basic interview best practices that we can provide here in the Division of Experience-Based Learning and Career Education, and hopefully this will be a helpful resource for you as you prepare for your next interview opportunity.